Hello, I'm Diane Cunningham. I'm a trustee of the London Society and founder of the Assembly Line. Along with Roland Carthouse from Matter Architect, we've been curating a month of talks with the London Society, considering changes in how we're using the public realm, partly on the back of the pandemic and partly around kind of changes that were underway already. Tonight we're looking at the high street. Obviously there's so many big names and the retail world has been pretty shaken by what's gone on in the last 12 years. But there's a chance to refocus and have a think about what we might find when things reopen next month, and the role of communities and how they'll play a part in reshaping that. So we've got a great panel tonight who'll share their stories about exploring these new approaches. And then we'll throw the session open to a bit more of a free discussion, and then there'll be a chance to have your questions answered at the end. So if anybody has any questions at any point, you can just pop them in the Q&A box and we'll go through those at the end. So in terms of the panelists, we've got Vidhya Alakeson from Power to Change, and she's Chief Exec. It's an independent trust established in 2015 to support the growth of community businesses across England to create more prosperous and cohesive communities. She's also a board member of the High Street Task Force, established by the government to support local leaders and transforming their town and high streets. We've got Robin Osterley, who's Chief Exec of the Charity Retail Association, the UK's only trade organisation representing the interests of charity shops and their parent charities. He's got a long-standing background in lobbying and advocacy work, and also been a representative on numerous government industry forums, including the Music Business Forum. Along with others, he's responsible for setting up the Sector Skills Council for the creative and cultural industries, and he'll be talking to us about the role of charity shops on the high street. We've got Chris Hildrey. Chris is an architect, director of Hildrey Studio and founder of ProxyAddress, which is a social enterprise providing stable addresses to those facing homelessness, which we'll hear a bit more about later. His work's been named one of the Beazley Designs of the Year, and he's been awarded the RIBA President's Medal for Research, the D&D Impact Award for Humanitarian Aid, and the Innovation in Politics Awards for Human Rights. And we've also got Adam Walker. Over the last 10 years, Adam's worked with local authorities, property funds, and development businesses across the UK to look at repositioning, delivering and operating mixed-use regeneration projects. It's enabled him to form strong working relationships with leading real estate players and local authorities, and really supporting regeneration programmes at neighbourhood level as to how we can repurpose space. So without more ado, I'll hand off to Vidhya to kick off tonight's panel.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks, Diane. Great to be here. I think it's going to be a really exciting discussion. So my perspective would be that moving forward, we've really got to put communities at the centre of our high streets and town centres. I think we need to put those with the longest term interest in place at the heart of driving forward change in that place. And for me, that's communities. And I think the pandemic has shown several things about the strength of communities and community organisations. They understand their local areas. They know what local people need. They're incredibly entrepreneurial and innovative. And we've seen a huge amount of pivoting and changing of business models among community businesses over the last year. And they have the potential to create more regenerative development that will enhance place rather than extract from place. Power to Change, as Diane said, is an independent trust. Over the last 6 years, we supported over 1,000 community businesses. So these are locally rooted businesses that trade for the benefit of their place and the local people within that place. Many of them have taken on high street properties and are part of the regeneration of town centres and high streets across the country. They've got a really strong track record now of doing this and being at the front end of change on the high street. And I'll give you a couple of examples in a minute, but I just wanted to draw on some research that we supported last year, done by the LSE, which shows what community businesses bring to town centres. And I think these are things that we're desperately in need of. So the first is diversity, and that creates footfall and inclusion. So community businesses bring something different to the high street, and that brings different audiences, different types of people into the high street, creating more diversity and cohesion within town centres. They are fantastically strong local economic development agencies. So our research shows that over half of what community businesses spend stays within the local area because they tend to employ locally, they have local supply chains. So they are community wealth builders in their local area as they deepen the economic development of their area. They contribute to local identity. So part of what I've talked about in terms of diversity is also shaping the identity of the place, bringing character and building on the heritage of a place. Many of them have play a big role in revitalizing heritage buildings, for example. So really building local identity. And they are hubs often within their community, creating social connection and cohesion. And altogether, those elements of what they can do create resilience in place. And I think one of the things that's become incredibly apparent with the shock of the pandemic is that the model of the high street that we have had with retail, large scale chain corporate retail as the backbone actually isn't resilient. It's proven to be incredibly fragile. So we need to build resilience in a different way. So to give you just a few examples of the kinds of things that we are seeing community businesses do on the high street, and many of these are organisations that we've supported. So the first is Upper Norwood Library Hub in London, which has taken over the former public library building. Within there is still a professional library service, but the space is now a multi-purpose community and performance arts space, including a library of things. So the Crystal Palace Library of Things is in there. So what it has been transformed a public building into a much richer community space, serving multiple needs within the community, drawing lots of different kinds of people to the town centre and the high street, and creating a vibrant space that is adding a sense of turnaround, hope, regeneration to the local area. And you'll see a theme in these examples. So regardless of what many community businesses set out to be, they often end up becoming hubs in the community. And this is another one. So this is Monkey Park Community Interest Company, which is in Chesterfield outside Sheffield. It took over a disused shop on the high street, has transformed that into a multi-purpose space. There is a bike workshop in there, a cafe, workspace, which is what you can see. So a different kind of multi-purpose hub to suit the needs of its particular community. And I think that's what we see time and time again, is that the nature of what's in these hubs is different because they're responding to the very local needs of their community. This is a different example from Union Street in Plymouth, which is run by Nudge Community Builders. It's called the Clipper, which was a pub, and for 4 or 5 years it was shut. It was a 24-hour pub that then closed. A community organisation took it over. It's turned it into a community hub, a market and cafe, and on the top, which partly is what drives the revenue from the building, some affordable housing. So again, a different constellation of how a building can be repurposed. And then finally, this is something we've supported last week, so very new to us, the Haven, which is in Southend. It's a former department store, and so one of the challenges that people often pose to us is, can community businesses take over something as large and substantial as a department store? And this is a really interesting partnership with Age UK. So it's again a kind of community hub, but with a particular focus on the over 50s, providing access to services, to support, but also to social interaction. So it's got a cafe inside it. So a really interesting way in which the department store is evolving to meet the needs of the local population in a different way. So what do I think we need for more of this kind of activity to be able to be present on the high street? So first is, I think we need a civic vision for the high street, and I think this is coming. And there's been a lot of momentum gathering behind the idea that the high street and town centre needs to be a civic rather than a commercial or retail space. But I think that fundamentally underpins a different way of thinking about what needs to be part of the high street. The second is a more strategic role for community organisations and community businesses. So we often see communities as a challenge, something to be consulted with. We need to move the role of community much more upstream. So communities are sitting around the table when local places are thinking about economic development, about the future of the high street. We need them to be decision makers because they do bring solutions, they bring expertise that can be particularly helpful in terms of this agenda. They need access to affordable space. And I'm really excited that we're just kicking off a new innovation platform with private property owners as well as with local authorities that's backed by the High Streets Task Force, working with New Local to start to have different conversations between owners and occupiers as to how more owners can work with community businesses and create opportunities for them to access space that is affordable, given that owners now have a challenge around using space. So there's a moment of opportunity here. And finally, the thing that is really important on this agenda is an activist local authority. So whether it's providing access to space or access to finance, local authorities are critical placemakers, and they are critical in terms of enabling community organisations, community businesses to play a greater role on the high street. So I think we need to shift from seeing community as a challenge to be managed to being a solution to be harnessed as we move forward and emerge from the pandemic. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I guess it's my turn. Vidhya, thank you. That was absolutely fascinating presentation. And one of the things that struck me looking at your slides was if you actually took the name of the venue away and replaced it with a charity shop name, you actually would probably recognize a number of those kinds of shops in a charity shop context as well. So I'm Robin Osterley, I'm Chief Executive of the Charity Retail Association. We have around 9,000 of the 11,200 charity shops in the UK in membership. And we look after them in a whole variety of ways, including, as Diane said, doing quite a lot of lobbying and advocacy work, and certainly talking extensively about the high street agenda. Obviously, there's hardly a high street in the UK that doesn't have a charity shop, sometimes quite a lot more than one as well. And they form an incredibly important part of the ecology of the high street. So what they do, I think, is probably just worth rehearsing here just very quickly. Obviously, everyone knows they're really there in order to make money for their parent charities, and they make a lot of it. It's about £1/3 of £1 billion a year in terms of the contribution that they make to their parent charities, and that's profit, not just income. So it's a hugely important part of charities' income, much of which, of course, has been lost over the last year for that, for obvious reasons. But they also do so much more than that. And we've run a couple of campaigns. We ran a campaign in Northern Ireland a few years ago called #MoreThanAShop. And actually, charity shops very often perform exactly the kinds of functions that Vidhya explained so cogently. I'll come to those in a minute, but I just wanted, before we get there, I just want to mention one other really important thing about charity shops. And of course, that's the positive environmental impact that they have. So they are responsible actually for keeping something like 50% of the UK's textile productions above ground, in other words, not being incinerated or sent to landfill. They are the principal facilitators of reuse of secondhand clothing in the UK by a significant margin. They create that conduit for people to move clothes from one place to another. And more of them are getting involved in doing that online as well as in bricks and mortar. But I think it's really important to realize that they do still consider bricks and mortar to be absolutely critically important in spite of the pandemic and the necessity for them to close. And we think that probably 95% of the charity shops that were open this time last year will be open again by the end of this year for sure. And possibly even the 5% will come back into existence maybe sometime next year. And the reason that they're so keen to do this and to keep going, apart from obviously the financial impact and the ability to raise much needed cash for charities very quickly, is because of this community relationship and this community hub. So we have a number of our members doing all the sorts of things that Vidhya has been talking about: running cafes, providing facilities for people to meet with one another, offering volunteering opportunities so that people can do fulfilling and interesting volunteering work, and also, of course, perhaps in the case of youngsters, to obtain skills that they wouldn't otherwise be able to get. Very crucially, to obtain a reference, someone who's prepared to actually put their name on a piece of paper and say they turn up, they don't steal the silver, they're reliable people, to gain additional skills in things like customer service and cash handling and all of those kinds of things, which a lot of people need. So they provide a very, very important focus for people in the community. But then there's also this aspect of just having somewhere to go and meet, to be amongst friends. And very often they're using their upstairs for additional facilities. We've got an amazing member in London called Wandsworth Oasis, who work extremely closely with a lot of other community groups, providing them with facilities and knowledge and information exchange and the ability to meet and talk with one another. So there's this big wraparound of community activity that the best charity shops are undertaking consistently. So that's a massively important aspect of what they do. But there's also the whole high street kind of ecology thing is crucially important. And we've got a really good example of this, actually. Goes back a way, but it's worth thinking about. In the last recession, in 2008, 2010, there was a particular town, Margate in Kent, which had the highest rate of shop closures in the country. It might be surprising, but that was the case. It was absolutely on its uppers during the last recession. The one sort of set of shops that didn't close, because people badly need charity shops during a recession. They need them at other times as well, but certainly they need them during a recession. And the one raft of shops that wasn't closing were the charity shops. They sort of hung in there while the rest of Margate was falling to bits. And that created, over time, a kind of foothold for retail in Margate. And gradually the shoppers started coming back. And different types of shops started opening up, because the charity shops were offering quite a wide range of differing facilities, things like boutique shops and vintage and retro shops and things that were quite interesting. A lot of shops started to latch onto that. A lot of commercial retail started to latch onto that and started to think, well, actually, we could put ourselves in Margate here and we'd be able to take advantage of some of that charity shop footfall, to the extent that now, I'm told, Margate is known as Shoreditch on Sea, because it's got such a sort of trendy vibe about it. And actually, the charity retail offering in Margate in the last part of the 2010s was largely responsible for that. So I think although there may be some sort of stereotypes and some prejudices, if you like, prejudgments about the role of the charity shop on the high street, in actual fact they played a really important part in driving footfall. We're aware of a number of local authorities that are now, well, not now obviously, but a year or so ago, were providing coach services to the charity retail centres of particular towns, because there was so much a magnet. And as Vidhya says, at a time when what we would traditionally call the anchor stores we heard the news about John Lewis this morning, when the anchor stores are starting to really suffer and not going to be able to make it, perhaps the new anchor is actually these kinds of community retail offerings, where people can go and have fun, have a coffee, meet people that they like, and hang in there. That's the charity shop story.
Thank you very much for that, Robin. Yeah, both really fascinating talks there. So I'll try and do my best to add a complimentary angle from myself. So I'm Chris Hildrey, so I'm the director of a design practice called Hildrey Studio, and as was mentioned earlier, also the founder of a social enterprise called ProxyAddress. And when it comes to the question of what will the high street look like when it reopens, I think there are many things to consider, many practicalities, everything from business rates to the impact of online shopping to public transport. But what I really wanted to use my time to speak about today was something I know a little bit more about, which is the way in which we can have an approach to using the resources of the high street as we come out of this situation. Because I think, as we all know, it's going to require some creative work to try and utilize what can be sometimes constrained resources in the best way to help not only the communities, but those who are marginalized as well. And so really, I wanted to share with you, let me just say here, a project that I've been working on, which is ProxyAddress. So what ProxyAddress does, which again was mentioned earlier, was we provide stable address details to people going through the instability of homelessness. And the reason for this was I'm an architect by trade, and actually this is kind of born out of a mild frustration as an architect, that despite being educated for some time over the things that should make the the built environment work. There wasn't actually that much agency as an architect to do that much about it, because really as an architect, people come to you to ask you to design what is going to get built rather than ask you to decide what should be built. And so you end up falling quite far downstream, really. And so what I wanted to do was find a way in which I could use my training to get the built environment, the public spaces that we know and love, to work for those who rely on them and who are currently marginalized by them, and to do that in a way that didn't necessarily require the upfront capital to build a building, which as an architect I certainly don't have. So I spent a little while as what's called a designer in residence at the Design Museum, and that's kind of a place where you can do a bit of research. And I went up and down the country, and I tried to battle some of my own naivety into the issue by speaking to people who were homeless, people who had been homeless, people who were policymakers, people from finance, from Post, anybody who would listen to me. And the things that really I learned shocked me, not only about the scale of the problem, about 1 in 200 people in the UK today are homeless, but also the way in which the behaviors happen within that. So most people think of homelessness and they think of rough sleeping, but actually the vast majority of homeless cases are people who are in temporary accommodation or sofa sleeping. So you can have a roof over your head and still be homeless. It's about the instability of the situation. And not only that, but we've recently done our own research during the pandemic, where we found on the National Representative Survey of over 1,000 people that 1 in 20 people would expect to be homeless within the next 6 months. When you look at under 35s, that's 1 in 10. So what we're seeing at the moment in this short period where we are protected by some temporary emergency measures is we're seeing people who are exposed to risk, who are temporarily protected, but once those temporary protections get removed, their risk is going to get exposed again. So it's vital that we make the high streets work for these people who will essentially rely on the public services and spaces that we may take for granted to get by. So the interesting thing for homelessness, about homelessness for me, is that there seems to be this assumption of this bell curve, this sort of dotted curve there, that most people have most of the problems, that they might have mental health issues or substance abuse issues. But in reality, the vast majority of people who become homeless do so fully capable of recovery. And the end of a tenancy is the #1 cause of homelessness today. And mental health and substance abuse tend to be caused by homelessness rather than causes of. And in speaking to people, what I found was this bizarre role of the address, where ultimately when you lose your home, not only do you lose your shelter, but by losing your address, you lose something that has become a de facto form of ID. And so without that piece of information, you lose access to everything from easy access to benefits, to applying for jobs, to getting posts, to opening a bank account, getting ID, even getting a library card so you can access public computers. So the very things that you need to get back on your feet are taken away at the moment when you need them most, because of the very reason why you need them. So it's this inherently difficult catch-22. And this is where I came up with the idea of proxy address, that why can't we use the address data of properties and premises that are potentially vacant, and essentially duplicate that address and tie it to an individual. So we use the fixed address data of vacant properties given to people who are going through a period of instability, and that creates a proxy address that remains consistent no matter where they move. An analogy I like to use is comparing a proxy address to a normal address is like comparing a mobile phone to a landline. In the sense, when you call a landline, the first thing a person always says is who they are. When you call a mobile phone, the first thing somebody says is where they are. You know, I'm on a train, etc. Because in the first instance, you know where you're calling, but you don't know who's going to pick up. In the second, you know who you're calling, but you don't really mind where they are. And if we're going to use addresses to define people and identify people, those people who move around a lot at the moment are currently marginalized. So it makes sense to find a mechanism to treat addresses in a way that it can follow the individual. So it applies to a huge number of different services, because one thing you'll find with homelessness especially is that any given individual situation is as complex as the next, and as individual as the person is as well. So it covers post, financial services and public sector services. And at the moment, we are in the middle of a live pilot in Lewisham. So we're currently helping people during the pandemic. And what that required was obviously a fair bit of pivoting to make sure everything was working remotely and with social distancing. But the other thing is that as we try and grow this service and make it accessible across London and beyond, we've got interest from other councils from Scotland and Wales, across England, some in the USA, Spain, even China have expressed some interest as well. In order to make sure that what we can do when we are expanding this service, to make sure that when you lose your home, you don't lose access to the support that you need. I think that the takeaway that I have from that and the relevance to how we deal with the high street at the moment is that we need to, in the short term, look at the resources that are available in the high street, both from a community sense, both physically in terms of the premises, but also in terms of any other areas of the existing high street that we might be able to draw from. Because although the answer to homelessness is housing with wraparound support, as you can see with initiatives like the Housing First initiative, then until we have those things, we need something in the meantime. And at the moment, every day, more and more people are becoming homeless, and we're about to see a lot more face that situation. So I think we need quite rapidly deployable interventions to help the high street get back on its feet. Thank you.
Hi everyone. It's I'm not sure if you can see me. I'm actually on the move at the moment. I've been looking at an asset today that needs repositioning on the south coast. So I'm Adam Walker, founder of a business called Curate, and I run a consultancy business called Curate, which looks at existing assets, new builds, meanwhile projects, regeneration projects across the UK, and I predominantly work with funds, institutions and local authorities. Today, my deck is going to concentrate on the perspective of an operator and an investor. So we've all seen an incredible step change, expedited step change over the last 12 months, and it has taken it's taken us all by incredible surprise of what's happened, and I think as an operator of sites historically, we've all had to pivot very, very quickly, and it's been a very, very interesting 12 months. And I think that my deck today will concentrate, the presentation today will concentrate on probably from an operator's perspective, the importance of our high streets, of our traders, of our entrepreneurs. And I think what's really come across as we've been forced to work from home and forced to explore our local community in our suburbs, in the regions that we live in, we have been embracing localism, and we have really been embracing provenance and understanding the story of these brilliant local entrepreneurs, these fantastic, the provenance of where perhaps their product comes from, if it's a food and beverage trader, etc., etc. It's been a very, very interesting year, and it's really highlighted that from an operational perspective, that it is massively important now to the consumer that they understand where their product is coming from. So we've also seen that this year has highlighted the challenges that between the digitally minded entrepreneur on the high street, retailer, the maker, creator, the doer, and perhaps the generation gap between the guys that are not quite digitally savvy and the guys that really need to catch up. So we've recognized that these guys and girls need support. These entrepreneurs need support. And what's really interesting to me is when we talk about cross-sector and cross-life is really, really important. Have an incredible amount to give. If we slide over to slide 2, thank you very much. As a site create, we see incredible uptake in the last 4 weeks, in particular for in registered interested parties for our new scheme in Wembley that we're going to be opening later this year once we know what going on in the world. And we've seen incredible uptake from cross-sector traders. So there's a real confidence out there at a micro retail service business level. We've also seen that the shared economy focused retailers and traders and entrepreneurs bring an incredible set of skills to the high street, and they have so much to give. Even with their relatively young, perhaps some of them are even pre-revenue, they have so much to give to established businesses and established traders, entrepreneurs, etc. Spoke briefly about the cross-sector curation of the high street and how important that is, and cross-life stage curation of the high street and retail environments. I spend most of my time at the moment looking at retail units, former retail units in typically incredibly high footfall locations pre-COVID. So it's a particularly exciting time for me, but there are an awful lot of challenges out there as an operator and an investor. We know that startup culture is infectious, and we do need to embrace it. And as I say, we need to embed that incubation culture back into our high street. So I've tried to highlight some challenges. Serena, would you mind switching on to the next slide? As I'm sat in my my pickup truck office somewhere in Sussex. So as an operator, work really closely with institutions, funds, banks, local authorities, investors, private sector investors as well. And it's been incredibly insightful over the last 12 months, and especially in the last 6 months, as we've seen the real struggles hit the institutions, the financiers, the investors, with deals that were struck 10 years ago and LTVs, loan to values that are now being breached under banking covenants. And you're seeing whole shopping centres coming to the market in fire sales. It's completely unprecedented times. It's exciting times, and there is definitely opportunity out there. Institutional ownership structures are really complicated. We know that, and we know that they're often entwined with local authority ownership, public-private sector partnerships, and it's incredibly hard and difficult to turn these big super tankers around. So we need agile, entrepreneurial, nimble mindsets brought back into to the fund managers and the guys and girls that run a lot of the asset or portfolios that sit on our high streets. We already know that the local authorities' balance sheets were already hugely stretched pre-COVID-19, so it's very difficult to go cap in hand to a local authority at the moment. The operator and investor confidence levels are pretty low at the moment, but there's a lot of opportunity. There are a lot of retail boxes. There are a lot of opportunities in the repurposing world. But again, there are very, very few at scale live examples. So comparables are few and far between, again, making it quite difficult to sell the dream when you try and pitch for investment from an investor. So my conclusions around next steps for the High Street 2.0, the High Street tomorrow, are that institutional investors and local authorities must part their pre-COVID precedent. The precedent is dead. And it's really important now that we move on, and we move on quickly. That the static space is dead, that the space now, whether it's a workspace or a retail space, it must be incredibly agile. It must be able to almost recurate itself overnight. It's so important that we build flexibility and agility into everything that we do in our retail and high street environments. Investor confidence is at an all-time low. It's very difficult out there at the moment for funds that predominantly collect rent from landlords, from tenants, retailers that aren't paying. So it's very, very difficult when you have conversations with investors at the moment in our sector. It's also apparent to me that innovation is being disabled by prehistoric business rates. We all know about that. We won't go on about it. And also service charge, the service charge, the historic service charge regime and how that works. And feel strongly that that is disabling creativity and innovation on our high streets and in our retail environments. But it is an amazing time, an unprecedented time in our sector, in this world. It is an incredible opportunity where you've got commercially minded creatives that can get in and do some incredible things that create incredible impact socially and commercially on our high street. So that's enough for me, and thanks very much.
Well, thank you to everybody. That was really quite exciting, but it was based on the opportunities that are ahead. It's really easy to get bogged down in all the kind of doom and gloom around the high street. So I think it's great that all four of you were able to kind of talk about these exciting projects that perhaps lie ahead of us. So just we've got time for a brief kind of discussion now. We're also throwing open Q&A to the audience. So if anyone's got a question, you can just drop it in the box, and we'll come to those shortly. But a couple of things to pick up with you. I think Chris summed it up with his sort of, we need to think about using resources differently, which was very much kind of the approach when we were looking at today's session, really. And I just wondered how easy it is to actually, find those resources, and particularly the video you touched on, sort of it's now possible for community groups to even take over department stores, which is obviously an awful lot of what we've heard of at these huge sites that are now sitting empty. But I mean, whether it's that or a new charity shop or a proxy address or a new site, is it still quite challenging to actually gain access to those or to have those conversations, or is it getting easier? Who would like to take that?
I'm happy to kick off, but others will have definite views, I'm sure. So it's still difficult. I think it's partly why I said one of the critical things for the growth of community businesses on the high street is activist local authorities. So not local authorities who want to control everything, but those who want to enable a different future for the high street and who want to work with other actors to bring that about. So I think it's still difficult in terms of access to space. It's still difficult in terms of access to capital, but that can be facilitated by local authorities. I think what's exciting is that we're now starting to have those conversations with private owners, because they also, as Adam was very eloquently illustrating, they have a huge problem. If you've got a shopping centre right now, you don't necessarily have what feels like much of an asset, but can you align that to the social economy of people who want to remain and run businesses in that local area? Yeah, absolutely. And we're seeing some interest there in starting to build those bridges and thinking about social value leases and other mechanisms that might make some of this more possible. But I think the bottom line is we live in a high street town centre environment where in most cities that the ownership of that is incredibly fragmented, mm-hmm. which is very difficult to curate. It makes it very difficult to know who owns what if you're trying to get your hands on it as a community organisation. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely still a challenge, but there are some organisations that are sort of pointing the way forward, I think.
Great. So anybody else want to jump in?
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. I think part of the reason why ProxyAddress uses the addresses rather than the actual properties themselves physically is because of the challenge in having to negotiate these kind of things to use the actual space. And in a sense, that was the design challenge, which was how do you get to deploy something as quickly as possible to help people who are in need now. But I think that the fact that is a design challenge is something that transfers to a broader situation that can apply to anything, in the sense that where you have opportunities and needs and issues faced, that's where you have to negotiate around. And I think no matter what we might want the high street to be, you have these constraints that exist, and the trick is to negotiate around these constraints and try and retain some sort of fidelity of mission through those constraints. So, I mean, for instance, one of the things that I think is going to be a huge factor to slightly add to what Vidhya was saying is, as you say, if you have a large shopping center, that doesn't feel like so much of an asset at the moment, and the likelihood is that it is unlikely to return to what it was before the pandemic, because we will probably see high streets be almost slightly decentralized, I think, as there are fewer people commuting into work in a CBD and having the same intensity of activity. So therefore, that is an opportunity where we can start to negotiate things and find alternative uses that might represent an opportunity to either people who own those properties or to local authorities who are going to be on the lookout for new ways to actually raise revenue or to utilize space that is otherwise lying empty.
Great, and I think you've all sort of touched on the what we're calling the sort of localism effect, really, of people being much better connected to their neighbourhood and rediscovering it. And yeah, as Chris, you've just pointed out, nobody seems in a drastic hurry to return to offices full time. But we'll see. It's all still guesswork right now. We don't really know how it's going to play out. But I mean, do we think this will sort of see off the clone town, which is sort of part of how we ended up here, really, with high streets all looking the same with the same stores on them? Do we think this will see a bit of a change in a more local approach?
Well, I would say so. I mean, it feels to me like we've historically, prior to COVID, everyone was complaining about business rates. Everyone was complaining about online, and it always struck me that nobody complained about the fact that, well, they did, but it was the consumers. It wasn't the sort of big cheeses. Nobody complained about the fact that all the high streets look the same. Not only do they look the same, but quite often they're selling the same stuff, actually, particularly in fashion. And I'm always very struck, if you pop to Brussels or Amsterdam or somewhere in Germany or Frankfurt or somewhere, those high streets, the high streets there are vibrant. They are places where there is, a great sense of excitement. People flock to them still, in spite of I know we've got a slightly bigger online share of the market over here than they do in Europe, but nevertheless, and perhaps that's the reason, because actually high streets are still very exciting places to go, because every shop, or almost every shop, is different. You go here, you could be parachuted into a high street in the UK, and you would have no idea where it was. It could be any one of 300 or 400, thousands of different places, which obviously, from our point of view, charity shops do provide a massive difference there. They are providing something that is completely different from commercial retail, and that's one of the reasons why people are so attracted to them, even when they don't have to buy there for reasons of economy. So I think you're right. I think this is an opportunity for a clear out. And just to the last question you asked, Diane, it feels to me like the planning system has managed to get itself into such a state that it is both too restrictive and too liberal. And I don't know quite how it manages that, but if there are various things that you want to do, you will find if they're the sorts of things that Adam was talking about, there's a good chance the planning system will get in your way. But on the other hand, if it's too liberal, if it becomes too much of a free-for-all, then there is no leadership, and the sorts of things that Vidhya was talking about end up coming into play, where local authorities are abdicating responsibility and just saying, oh, well, you can do what you like. And that is, so there's got to be some measure for us anyway, there's got to be some measure of top-down planning, but it has to be done on a very, very flexible basis. And the local authorities have got a huge part to play in this. And because we deal with people all over the country, we see this massively. Some local authorities are really good and really supportive in this area, and others are completely useless. And we need to find some degree of happy medium where there is some leadership being provided by these guys.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's essential, and it is a bit of a lottery. But I'm sure it's a lottery amongst the John Lewises, etc., of this world too, from branch to branch. So it's interesting. Adam, I don't know if you want to jump in with your experiences of perhaps finding new sites, even, or how you expand. Has that changed?
Yeah, I think to actually question one or point one, I think now more than ever, the door will be open with a lot of these institutional owners, funds that own a lot of the asset or the asset classes that used to be known as retail and shopping centres. I think I think now more than ever there is a deal to be done with these fund managers. They've all got massive problems across their portfolios. So I think you'll find it's a good time to be going in with some curveball left field ideas around recurating or reimagining or repositioning some of the retail boxes that they've got. Yeah, and I also think that I actually am a massive advocate of charity shops, and personally, if I see a British Red Cross, or there's one in Islington that I go to, and it's absolutely brilliant. I go in there and I always get something fantastic from there. My wife always says to me, you do so well every time you go in there, and I do. I always do really well when I go there. But for me, I couldn't agree more. They are a massive part of our high street. They're incredibly important. They have never been so important as we come out of this pretty terrible state that we've ended up in, economic state and imbalance perhaps. And I think that I'm careful what I say about Costa, because I've got a Costa in one of the sites that I built. But you know, I do totally believe in the localism and the provenance piece that I spoke about. And I do absolutely believe that this newfound time that we have now to explore our neighborhoods and find our local hero traders and our local hero entrepreneurs, I think it is their time now. It is their time to come back, set businesses up on the high street, work with landlords that are, frankly, their backs are against the wall. It's a good time to be having those conversations, getting deals on units. There are institutions out there now that are doing all sorts of really interesting things with their retail assets. There's examples of institutions that are giving units, whole rows of units away, and they're tightly curating it. And it's all about that incubation culture. It's all about embedding that back into the asset and almost rebooting the asset.
Great. I'm just going to run through. We've had quite a few questions have come in. So as we were focusing on the charity shop sector and that little roundup, so we've got a question on the sort of the growth in the charity sector in terms of taking over vacant shops in the high street. So I guess one for you, Robin, as to whether that sort of growth is still there.
I'm not sure right at the moment that there's going to be too many additional charity shops. Really tough out there, really tough. I think they will grow back. As I said, we think probably 95% of them will be back in place by the end of the year. That remaining 5%, which is still quite a lot of shops, by the way, we're hoping will. I mean, there's generally a fair amount of churn because people, you know, leases come to an end. They want to find a shop in a more profitable location, so they close shops and they open shops. What's happened at the moment, they've closed them and they haven't yet reopened them. I'm strongly suspecting that will happen towards the end of this year or early next year. I wouldn't expect to see a very large growth in charity shops, however many vacancies there are. I think there is a sort of settling point here, because it's part of an ecology. And you can't have a high street that is entirely full of charity shops. That wouldn't work, just as it wouldn't work if it was entirely full of coffee shops or Primarks. So I don't think we can really take up the slack in that way, but I think what we can do is provide this kind of anchor, which a lot of the large stores are starting to fail used to provide. Interesting example. British Heart Foundation just opened, well, not that long, it was about a year ago actually, opened this massive superstore in Kingston, which was a British Home Stores. So only had to change one letter on the sign, so that was helpful. But you know, that is an example of taking up the slack, and that store has been extremely successful. But you know, we can't be doing that all over the place. It has to be a much more mixed economy than that. Would be my take.
And coming back to that sort of personal local approach as well, you know, you've said it's brilliant in Kingston, it's working well, but we've sort of got to be really nuanced as to places that things are happening in, that they suit them. And a similar question really around what else we think might appear on high streets. So we've got a little mention of concentrating services on the high streets, so particularly sort of medical ones or education, nurseries. And, you know, do people see that sort of being something that they should expect to find there? I know this week I saw there was a shopping centre somewhere in Essex, I can't remember where, but it was kind of, they were saying they were going to put kind of blood testing facilities in for the hospital, and that would kind of, you know, take up potentially the whole ground floor of a vacant shopping centre. So it seems like it's being talked about, but I guess it's not really been forefront in the reuse conversation.
Yeah, could I just start on? Sorry to step in there. Just by a nose. Yeah, I was just going to say this topic was kind of what put me down the line on going towards ProxyAddress, which is this changing nature of our public spaces in a sense. I mean, we've spoken about the need for variety, which I think is absolutely vital, as you say, and I remember when I was going around doing the research and going to, you know, Leeds and Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool, and you get off the train station, those high streets, you know, you almost forget where you are, as was said earlier. But in addition to the variety, when you find the contrasting elements of that, you also get, I feel like, a much better sense of municipality. And I think that's something that has been increasingly missing. And in a sense, it's part of the symptom of what we've had as, you know, a decade now of austerity and what may be several decades ahead of austerity. But I mean, it was amazing to see in Vidya's presentation that the libraries, for instance, that's something that I'm incredibly passionate about. And, you know, my local libraries have closed, and it's those kind of things are such community hubs that are so vital. And everything from parklands being closed and, you know, libraries being shut, public toilets closed. We've got a huge crisis of public toilets across the UK. Playgrounds, you know, being maintained, all these kind of things. I think having a concentration of community elements, especially things like utility things like healthcare and things, is vital. But if we can start to also include that wider sense of municipality, that's a stage off which community can grow. And I think what we'll need to do is I mean, we'll need some funding somewhere, but for me, that's so key to the character of a space, is to have that common ground in the middle where people can collect together.
Yeah, Vidya, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I can't disagree with that. I just feel so. I mean, I think mixed use in all its varieties is critical to the future of town centres, and I think public services have a huge part to play, as well as Chris was saying, those other kind of municipal buildings. I think we've been having some really interesting conversations. We published a report probably end of last year, with the NHS Confederation about the move of health services into town centres, and actually how that could enable access as well as drive up footfall. I mean, it's very easy to see how the combination could work for both the health services and the high street. And I think it brings a different revenue stream into town centres, which is also going to be really critical. I think one of the challenges I always see is that there aren't many forums where local authorities, the private sector and the community sector actually really come together. And I think that's what's often missing, is that we need all of those actors to come together to create the new vision for the town centre. And you know, you've got business improvement districts, you've got the local authority, they often don't really talk to each other. You've got very few places where community organisations would sit alongside all of those actors. So the sort of governance, for want of a less sort of administrative term, just doesn't really exist. So we've been looking at the concept of a community improvement district. Could you have something which tries to bring multiple actors together rather than sort of separating them out? But I think this is pretty critical for how we move forward.
Yeah, I think that would be great. We've got two related questions. One is about hospitality being major drivers of footfall to high streets, and a related one around the nighttime economy. So I guess, you know, like Robin's just touched on, it can't all be streets full of coffee shops, but the hospitality sector in particular has just been decimated by what's happened so far, and they're amongst the last to open. You know, how important is that going to be in coming back? And then in turn, I guess stage 2 will be them sort of really rebuilding their nighttime economy again.
I know a few people in the catering business, and their December was the best month they'd ever had.
Yes.
So they were shut for November, obviously, and they kind of knew they were going to be shut after Christmas. Their December was their best month of trading ever. I think a lot of these things are going to bounce back, actually. I think people are desperate for a cup of coffee that they didn't make themselves, and they're definitely desperate to go to pubs and restaurants. There's no question of that. Whether it'll be enough to survive, of course, is another question. But I think the nighttime economy is incredibly important, and I think this is one of the issues with the kind of popular view that all you can do is turn people into, all you need to do is turn these things into residential accommodation. I don't think that's going to work really, because apart from anything else, if you've got shops in there, they need, they often will need to have things delivered in the middle of the night, big lorries going past, and then if you've got a massive nighttime economy going on with people yelling and shouting and having fun, that's not very conducive to sleep either. And I just wanted, just moving from there, because I just wanted to add very quickly to the last conversation, which I think Vidya's comments were absolutely 100% right, because you haven't got a one-size-fits-all solution here. Not every town centre and high street is going to be the same, and that's why you need the local community to get together with the local authority and decide what is appropriate for that particular high street. And that, so I don't think it's very good to, I mean, we're never going to find a magic bullet, bang, yes, residential, bang, yes, let's have more hospitality, bang, yes, let's have less hospitality. We need to think about these things, and they need to be applied to the specific place in which we're talking about.
Great. And we've got a question perhaps for Vidya again on if you're experiencing creating neighbourhood forums to see how high streets can change. Is that sort of a good route to go down?
Yeah, so it can be. I think the challenge with neighbourhood forums is that they are quite onerous to get started. So they can be a really good route, and they have been very successful in places like Camden and in some rural parts of the country, but they do take quite a lot of effort from the community to get them started in terms of the whole neighbourhood forum, and then to do the neighbourhood plan. And then one of the things I've always found slightly bonkers is that once you get your plan approved, you have to disband the neighbourhood forum. So like, why spend all that time setting to be really powerful locally and then have to get rid of it? Understand why it works like that. But so I think there are, I mean, I think what I would like to see is more variety in how communities can get engaged in shaping their place. So I think neighbourhood forums, and basically I'm just repeating what Robin said in different words. It's got in different places, and neighbourhood forums will work in some places. It's a bit like parishes. So why was Queen's Park able to set up an urban parish council, but most other parts of the urban landscape don't have parishes? It's like some things work in some areas and they won't in others. So I think what we need is diversity and multiplicity of forms of engagement, so that communities can get engaged in shaping their local place. But I don't think we can put all of our money on it's got to be a neighbourhood forum or it's got to be a parish council. We know that places and people are too diverse to have that one-size-fits-all approach.
Yeah, many different guises these days as to what format they happen in. And we've only got a minute or two left, so we've sort of got a related question about sort of, I mean, you have a choice really, I think, as to what you can answer. So it's either how optimistic each of you are about the high street a year from now, or instead you can kind of maybe say what you'd like to see if you could have one change that might make things easier. So
well,
who wants to go first?
Thing, if you like. I'm really optimistic about high streets in market towns, in suburbs, in places, bits of London. I'm really not at all optimistic about city centre type high streets. I think if you're relying on your footfall for office workers, you are in real trouble, because I don't think we're going to have any office workers in 1 to 2 years time, or hardly any. So I think I think those are the places where most attention is going to be needed. I think there's a lot of people going to be flocking back to the high street. And provided we make the kinds of adjustments that we've been talking about over the last hour, I think they'll do well. But I'm really worried about city centres.
Okay. Next. Vidya, you're on mic'd, so.
Okay, I will go. I was going to let Adam go because it's harder for him to join in on the M25. I'd say I am quite optimistic, but I think the one thing I'd like to change is business rates. I think it is still a massive barrier to the kinds of innovation as well as the established actors on the high street.
Okay, Adam?
Yeah, I mean, naturally, I'm an optimist. I think that I think that the geographies like the suburbs have been underserved for way too long, and they've been poorly served, and the provision that we've been forced to accept in the suburbs and the regions has been unacceptable. So I think now is their time, and I think that we get some quality offers, some quality mixes, some quality operators into the suburbs, and we bring city centre, dare I say it, London standard workspace, London standard hospitality in our suburbs. The stuff that we are used to in the old world of getting on the tube every day and going up and having a bit of fun at work every day. Great.
Okay, Chris?
I was going to say business rates as well, but one particular part of it, I think from my point of view, which is, although I tried to not mention business rates, but I think
it's right at the end. So
yeah, one of the things that I think is, for me, absolutely vital to get right is to try and redress the local retention of business rates and the sliding scale we're going on there, because I think what we're finding is, you know, back in the old days, 2010, before everything, you know, business rates were collected by central government and allocated according to need to local authorities. We've talked a lot here about the need for funding of local authorities and for local authorities to step up. And I think retaining local business rates within local authorities will just lead to a spiraling of the problem, where those who have a robust high street will end up with more business rates being retained. Those who are suffering as a result end up with less business rates coming in. I think we need to recognize the situation and redress that.
Great. Well, thank you to all of you. It's been really fascinating, and hopefully everybody else found it interesting by the number of questions that came through. And next week we are looking at cities through young people's eyes. So looking at much more of the younger generation, how they might plan their cities and how they can be actively involved. So yes, same time next week. Thank you, everybody.